Okay, what's good? What's good? Yeah, I don't think that Instagram is being a pain in the butt. For all you people on Instagram, my bad. No, Instagram. All right, what's good, everybody? Welcome to Cops and Convicts Live. I'm your host, Sean Shepard, and we're streaming live on Facebook. I thought Instagram not cooperating once again, YouTube and LinkedIn. So please subscribe and follow us on those platforms. Alfonso's pulling double duty this week. I just had him on with us live 2 nights ago. So I want to thank you, Al, for joining us. Alfonso Esquer, former Maricopa County Sheriff Deputy, former DEA Agent, former Marine, veteran, husband, father, and has spent a great deal of time focusing on mental health as it relates to law enforcement. Al, thank you again for joining us. Can't thank you enough.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Hey, bro. So I want to jump right into one of your most memorable experiences when you were a DEA agent. So for our viewers, take us through that traumatic event where you were held captive. Set that up for us.
Sure. So there's a few events, but I believe the one that we spoke of the last time, I had been involved in an enforcement activity where we had set up an environment where we were going to have suspects that were planning to buy a certain amount of drugs, a large quantity, which was going to be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that had come about by negotiations and things that had been done previous to that event. So now this was the day that we were going to get it done. And I was acting in an undercover capacity. So what I was going to be portraying was a drug trafficker from Mexico that was going to be providing the drugs to the buyers. The buyers happened to be a pretty large gang in the community. And so we had known about them and we had done our homework about who we expected to be there, but we never expected what actually happened. So I show up to the scene, and even beforehand, we have police officers in the area, but they're in non-marked vehicles and in plain clothes, so you won't likely recognize them. And it was done in a shopping, like a grocery store parking lot. So I'm parked and I'm waiting for the suspects to show up. And maybe a few minutes as I waited there, 3 SUVs showed up and boxed in my vehicle. And they came out fully loaded and ready to rip off the drug load. In the police investigations world, that's called a drug rip. So they came out with rifles. So what I was able to see was about 3 different individuals coming very quickly to my vehicle with rifles, and they immediately opened the doors. They told me to stay in the vehicle. 1 jumped into the driver's side, 2 others jumped in the back, and their rifles were pointed directly at my head. Next thing you know, I'm bagged. I believe it was a black pillowcase. And so I'm sitting there in the passenger seat with a black pillowcase over my head, and I begin to feel the blunt of a rifle hitting me in the head, in the back, from the back driver. Or I'm sorry, the person who was in the back seat. And then the guy who was on the driver's seat, he was also pointing his weapon at me. And I could see just slightly out of that pillowcase. And what really caught my attention, what really brought me to the point of the mass amounts of trauma and the hormone adrenaline, that fight or flight system kicked in, and I could see the guy in the passenger seat or in the driver's side holding his rifle and with his finger on the trigger. And at that point, I felt I was helpless. I did have immediate flashes of of me dying that day. And so I started to just recall just different memories of my family and just things that were more important than what I was involved with at that time. Uh, just before that, doing this enforcement activity was really at the top of my priority. I mean, I lived for this type of thing. And it's funny how when you find yourself in that type of situation, how the significance or the importance of that type of thing just goes out the window. And I really could care less about my employment or who I was, representing. I thought I was going to die, and so I had a decision to make. Also, I had my weapon, my firearm in my belt, just tucked right inside of my belt loop. And so for a few seconds, I thought about reaching for that and then trying to defend my way out of it. But there was no way I would have really survived that with 3 rifles pointed directly at my head and then having very limited visibility. So I just let it play out. Uh, the driver began to drive as he saw my team start to move in. So the driver started to drive away, and very high speed. You know, very reckless through the parking lot. There was people around and all that type of thing. But I'm still bagged, so I can't fully see everything. I'm just trying to make out as much as I can to really just to survive. But I did catch a glimpse at one moment where I saw the driver. He was not noticing me. He wasn't paying attention to me. The 2 guys in the back were looking. I could tell that they were looking out their windows at my team that was following them. They were trying to identify them. And I took that moment to jump out of the window from the moving vehicle. And, I encountered all kinds of road rash, but I survived and I lived, to see another day. I quickly ran and found somewhere to hide behind, to conceal myself. And then somebody from my team came and picked me up. My adrenaline was still going, so I still wanted to get back into the fight. As in, I told my team member that had picked me up, I said, let's go, let's see how this plays out. I want to see what happens. And so we went to the scene to where my team was still following behind the vehicle that had ripped, and the vehicle was loaded with drugs. So that was a big liability for my agency, that we would actually put drugs out onto the street and then manage to get them ripped off. So we couldn't allow that to happen. So at this point, we are going to do whatever it takes to apprehend these guys. And I'm right there. I'm probably 3 or 4 cars behind, as the passenger in my team member's vehicle. Eventually, their vehicle goes off the side of a embankment and it flips over a few times, and it caused a great big mess. There was drugs all over the streets. They happened to break out of the windows as the vehicle was flipping. They arrested them, took them back, processed, did all that type of stuff, and I went back to the office as well as where those the individuals were. That's where it really became real to me. Now I had time to think about what I had just encountered. My mind started to process it, and it's something when you're at a really high level of adrenaline, and then all of a sudden that adrenaline just kind of returns back into the body. You feel like this, just instant tiredness, and you're just kind of confused. And I remember getting questioned by my team and my superiors at that time, asking, if I was okay, because they had seen me jump out of the window and they just see a body flying out. They're wondering what was going on. But instinctively, the first thing I said was, boss, don't take me out of this fight. I want to go back, because there was still what we learned was that there was a bigger group that had hired this gang to be the ones that were going to rip the drug load. And so as soon as I found that out, I wanted to go back and I wanted to be a part of that arrest. I wanted to be a part of that enforcement activity, just so we could get the whole plan completed. And my boss looks at me and he goes, "Are you crazy? What you just went through? I can't believe there's no need for you to get out there in the street." And I said, no, I'm fine. I'm fine. I'll brush it off. It seemed that I had come to a point to where I had become used to this type of behavior, because I share it now, and it just sounds crazy to think that I would go through something like that and then just immediately want to go back and still take part in the plan that we had formulated. But I believe that just after seeing so many different incidents that were similar to this, having experienced so much trauma and then just having found a way to somewhat callous my mind and my emotions and to not really feel anything. And you hear about that through military veterans or those that are in the military. They talk about it with 1,000-yard stare, kind of this blank stare that happens when you encounter significant trauma, and that your emotions are somewhat cut off from your body. I believe I was in that state at the time. It led to me having to go see a psychologist, but I really just told them what they wanted to hear because I didn't want to get uh, an administrative type of position if they thought that there was any type of mental health challenges going on inside of me. So I just said what they needed to hear. I said, I'm fine. I'm going to make sure I take care of myself. I'm going to do all the right things. And next thing you know, I was back at work the next day, ready to go again.
How long did you stay with the DEA after this incident?
I'd say probably about another 5 years. And it's something now that we're talking about it, it's bringing me back to those days. I'm just thinking that because I had survived that particular event, it kind of gave me this motivation to go even further. And I mean, it may sound, again, kind of crazy, but um, it was just a part of the culture. It was something that you just kind of learn to deal with, and so I continued to take very risky steps, all in hopes and motivation of being the best. That was really what motivated me and was what was my drive. My driving force was really just to be looked at and to be respected among my peers for being able to make good cases and apprehend those that we sought to apprehend.
So very few people have had the life experience of having a rifle or shotgun to your temple and fearing for your life and knowing that your life was in imminent danger and that it could end at any moment. When you look back at that particular traumatic experience and other traumatic experiences that you've had as a member of law enforcement, from a mental health standpoint, Al, how has that affected you? What are some of the things that you've had to deal with as a result of having your life threatened, being at the point where you may not make it home to your family, and really being held at gunpoint with a pillow over your head?
Sure, it's had some significant impacts in my life. Uh, while I was in the department and while I was functioning within my role, it's I felt the impulse that things weren't right within me. Uh, and what I'm speaking of is the mind has a certain way, or the brain has a certain way to protect itself, and it could shut down during certain moments that are certain events or certain moments where you're triggered by certain things. And I could feel that I was being triggered more consistently. I would see somebody, and it's like as if their image would change into somebody that had possibly been a part of a traumatic event. It's like as if my perception was slightly off. But again, my motivation was to be the best, and so I didn't have time to deal with that at the time. Also knowing that there was a stigma in law enforcement for anybody that was stigmatized with any type of mental health or mental health challenge, or that was prescribed medications, psychotropic medications that might uh, entail some side effects or those type of things. That type of thing may cause you to lose trust among your peers, as in that person is not fully mentally uh, fit, even though the majority of my peers faced many of the same circumstances I did. And even speaking with them, I could hear through their words, kind of reading between their words, or listening deeply and intentionally. I could hear that they suffered from many of the same things that I did. So I continued to really just push it back down inside of me. And that's really where post-traumatic stress disorder comes in, different than just post-traumatic stress. We all encounter some form of post-traumatic stress. If you go through a traumatizing time, there could be stress that follows that. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a disorder. The disorder comes in when then it's a continual process, and then it begins to have an impact, a negative impact in your life. And so I began to recognize that I was being impacted in many different ways. And one way was I needed to find different elements, substances to help me cope with a lot of the bad thoughts, the distorted thinking, nightmares, and also just the way that I viewed people. So anytime we do any type of enforcement activity, meaning we're setting up a plan to possibly execute a search warrant or an arrest warrant, or if we're just going to do surveillance, but we know that surveillance, who we're surveilling may be armed or may be considered a dangerous group of people, even in the planning stages, because before we would go out and leave the office, we would thoroughly plan what we were going to do and have contingency plans in case things didn't go. I would begin to get this adrenaline rush, and it's as if I needed more of that. I loved to be able to be a part of enforcement activity, as in I would even volunteer to other groups, like other squads, to go and I would ask, hey, if you're doing any type of enforcement, you feel free to count on me, and all, kind of like extra duty that I had no real commitment to. But it's as if my brain then started to thirst or hunger for that adrenaline. I just couldn't get enough. And that's why I believe I got into a little bit more than the average person as far as risk would go.
So, Al, you've talked to me about the effects on the brain with this being in a constant state of adrenaline rush. Explain to us the effect that always being in a state or always being in circumstances that bring that adrenaline rush. Explain the effect on the brain over a period of time.
Sure. So it probably began for me because I also served 8 years in the United States Marine Corps before that, and during 2 conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that's when I really began to understand the effects, the long-term effects of the release of the hormones that happen within our bodies when we encounter events that are high adrenaline or traumatic or just those kind of events that are just out of the ordinary type of events. So sitting in a prolonged period of trauma, or best known as the fight or flight setting, where you encounter something that possibly triggers fear or that adrenaline rush. The brain has a defense mechanism that will go into this fight or flight. So you're either going to fight, you're going to flight, as in you're going to flee, or you're going to freeze. And when that happens, cortisol is also released within the brain, and that's where you get that adrenaline rush. And we've all had it, I'm sure. Just think about going down a roller coaster or some form of excitement. It could feel good, but a prolonged amount of cortisol release into the brain, studies show that it could cause brain damage. And I know this from experience because I'm also a veteran, like I mentioned, of the Marine Corps. So I visit the Veterans Administration, and I recently participated in a traumatic brain injury research study. And I volunteered for this because I wanted to know myself better. And I continuously want to know how to improve myself. But what they found out was that the amount of cortisol for prolonged periods of time can cause this traumatic brain injury. And we found out by when the medical staff did brain scans on the brain, and we could see how there's deficiencies in certain parts of the brain where this cortisol then is released in the brain, and long-term exposure then is where it begins to have those negative effects on the brain. And that's where somebody will experience the long-term post-traumatic stress then disorder.
So you had mentioned some of your coworkers experiencing what you've experienced. One of your good friends, Suli Afuk, that was on the podcast with us a couple of nights ago. He talked about the effect that came as a result of him being involved in an officer-involved shooting and him, unfortunately, having to take the life of a San Diego citizen in self-defense. Let's take a look at that clip real quick.
That sergeant, we did have a talk afterwards, and he was telling me that I need to get help, but he would also cover for me, right?
How so? How so?
He wouldn't bring it up to the higher ups. Sully, just take care of yourself, man. Make sure you're good to go, okay? And we'll keep watching over you. But in all reality, that was a clear signal that I needed to be off duty at that moment.
So I wanted to share that clip because a lot of our viewers don't know his story. Former San Diego Harbor Police Department officer got into a situation where he was fighting for his life and wound up having to take the life of his assailant. The guy had gotten a hold of his taser, had put the taser to the base of Sully's skull for 40 seconds. 40 plus seconds. He blacked out, thought he was dead, woke up, got up, guy came at him, and he had to defend himself. And unfortunately, man's life was ended at that particular point in time. And what Sully was describing in that clip was he went back to work and he couldn't function. And he knew something was wrong. And he was explaining how his sergeant knew something was wrong too, covered for him, told him to get some help, and whatever help he was getting, it wasn't working, and he ultimately resigned from the force. I bring that up because we want to talk more about the mental health issues that members of law enforcement have, and you've outlined your own so eloquently, and also really gave a great example of how prolonged and repeated experiences that bring about adrenaline rush and cortisol release into the brain brings about damage to the brain. So if you're in a major city like Los Angeles or Chicago and you've been a beat cop for 13, 14 years, Al, is it safe to say that you've been in some repeated situations where you're in a fight or flight situation and there is a release of adrenaline, or not even fight or flight, just car chases or routine traffic stops? There's some sense of tension when you go up to a car, no matter how many times you've done it. Am I right?
That's absolutely correct. Yes.
So talk to us about your views on law enforcement mental health, and do you feel like enough is being done to address the mental health and well-being of officers?
Sure. That's a great question. And that's one of the things that troubles me as far as being now a community member and thinking about the officers that are out there with possibly the majority having the best of intentions to be those public servants and to accomplish what they set out to when they first came in. But after a time, the brain begins to wire. And once that occurs, it begins to wire with what you're with what you're seeing, with what you're constantly seeing. If you think about the first responder who may show up just to a traffic accident, but then find out that there's dead bodies or possibly even a child sitting back there, those type of memories don't leave. And then there's a wiring that occurs that's an unconscious behavior, something that we may not even be fully aware of what's happening inside of us. But I have to believe that the majority of our first responders encounter trauma on a consistent basis, even if it be vicarious trauma. In the interview with the two gentlemen, Sully and Daniel, and I'll share more about it as well, because law enforcement is such a tight knit group. You've heard us mention that it's like a brotherhood. I believe even Daniel mentioned it's even closer. He felt that it was even closer than he was with his own brothers, or as a brotherhood. So when somebody else experiences trauma, and it's fully and thoroughly investigated and talked about, that trauma may vicariously then pass on to you. And so the department will randomly throw out suggestions, as in, we know that this happened to this officer, and if anybody else needs to speak to a psychiatrist, or somebody that they trust, we encourage it. But it's encouraged, but with not much weight behind it. I mentioned that after my incident, I was kind of coached into making sure that I say the right things, because what I say in the presence of a licensed counselor and somebody who's a mandated reporter, if I mention things that reveal that I'm not fit for duty, or that I'm too far gone because I've experienced too many things that could really affect my career, and that's really what is the last thing that I'm wanting. So that's why I was having to hide my truths, and I feel that many officers would probably be able to relate to that type of story, as in to not disclose the absolute truth, as in what they're encountering, how they're feeling, their suppressed emotions, their inability to process what's happened, not wanting to talk about it. The policing culture already does a great job of keeping most incidents or most events that police encounter on the down low, or just isolated, as in we don't air out our dirty laundry. So really you're left to have to deal with that situation by yourself. And you don't want to take that stuff back home to the family and to those that are closest to you. I didn't want to, after a day's work, and if I encountered, just all kinds of madness out there, that's the last thing I talked about. My wife would ask, "How was your day?" And I would say, "Oh, it was great, usual." The day that specific event happened, where I felt that I was, very close to death, I didn't talk about it for a while. I believe my wife actually found out by the news clips later on, that the day or the following day. I mean, something that's not talked about. So suppressing our feelings and emotion is only what will then exacerbate that trauma. And another thing that truly exacerbates trauma is being around other traumatized people. And so in law enforcement, I could say that I was holding on to trauma because I wasn't talking about it. I wasn't processing that trauma. I wasn't seeking really any type of help. I thought, well, I'm strong. I could get through this. And that was the same mentality as my peers had. So we didn't talk about those type of things. If we talked about it, it was more jokingly, as in, you should have done this, or, just kind of roasting each other type of thing. But it wasn't about, tell me about how you feel. We didn't talk about the truths about what we're really experiencing. So traumatized people, to put them with other traumatized people, only compounds that trauma. And that makes me also think about incarceration and those dealing with mental health challenges. Somebody who is dealing with mental health challenges and then is detained and arrested based on their health issue, mental health challenges, then they're isolated with far worse traumatized people inside of this institution, and isolated. Those two recipes there is the recipe for disaster for somebody who's experiencing mental health challenges: isolation, and isolation with somebody else who's traumatized.
Al, just fascinating stuff. Just want to check in with folks. We're live tonight on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. My guest is Alfonso Esquer, former Maricopa County Sheriff Deputy, former DEA agent, former Marine. Al, a lot of people don't know that the leading cause of death amongst law enforcement is suicide. And we have to believe, based on the things that you've said, that this is a health crisis inside of law enforcement, and it stems from untreated trauma, untreated, or it's either untreated or undertreated mental health issues that members of law enforcement experience as a result of participating, or I shouldn't say participating, as a result of being employed as a member of law enforcement. Shout out to my cousin Dante. He's asking, as a result of the trauma that you've experienced and the mental health challenges that you face as a result of being a member of law enforcement, has that affected your sleep patterns at all?
Very much so. I could say in current day, I feel like that's been changed, rectified. There is hope, but it took some time and it took some serious work on my end. Yes, there was many endless nights. I'm one of those type of people that just kind of learned to stay up, to not have to go to sleep. I hear most people talk about sleep as in something that's enjoyable. To me, it was more as in, I don't want to go there. How could I sleep the least amount of time, but then still function effectively the next day? And it's a very tough challenge. So I'm thinking about others that are involved in traumatic events. One is the trauma that they're holding on to, but next is I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought.
So the trauma, one of the things that is the trauma that they hold on to.
The lack of sleep. Because if you're being woken up by nightmares or just this fear of going to sleep, because when you're sleeping and you're in the middle of a nightmare, basically reliving that trauma, but helpless because you can't really defend yourself. You don't have the team that you're used to come into your rescue. It's a hopeless state. And for me, I said I'd like to avoid that as much as possible. I don't feel that I'm alone on that. And so I think about, if law enforcement officers are avoiding sleep, one, it's significantly bad for your health. But we know in just ourselves, if you've ever lacked sleep, you know how you feel, kind of sluggish, like a zombie kind of thing. You're not thinking as well. You're not alert. Your reaction time is a little slower. You're not making the best decisions, the best choices. So how long could somebody continue to exist in that state of mind? Lacking sleep, fearing sleep, constantly being in fear of what you're having to relive, and also not having anybody to go to really tell that story to, or to be able to process those things. And that's why I think it's so important. It's a significant principle that those that are involved in traumatic employment, such as law enforcement, first responders, that they find a group of people that they could actually connect with and be themselves around, be able to process and talk about information. I know culturally we have this thing about not wanting to open up or not wanting to share, which in the law enforcement community, it's actually supported that you don't open up too much, because and especially in my agency, because we were really operating in an undercover capacity, as in we didn't wear the uniforms and have the marked vehicles. So even my neighbors around me thought I was employed by a different employer. I never really revealed my identity. So my lifestyle began to really be concealed and hidden. So then my problems and traumas that I carried then were also concealed and hidden, even from the people closest to me. And if you could think about how that causes conflict in the home, if I'm dealing with something that's significant, that truly impacts me and the way I see people and even treat people, but I can't really talk to about it, even to the closest people around me. One, because I care for them and I don't want them to know. I don't want them to be impacted by my problems. But then it's frustrating for somebody who cares for you, that says, I don't mind hearing what you've been through because I want to help. But then it goes to that lack of trust, and there's just so many factors that go in there. So really you're left to deal with it alone. And so I understand the truly sad nature of the position that would lead somebody to then commit suicide, because they're in this state of isolation. They feel like there's nobody that can understand them. There must be something wrong with me. These are just common misconceptions that somebody may have about themselves.
Yeah, when you talk about relationships, we know that the divorce rate amongst members of law enforcement is higher than people who aren't in law enforcement. And as we transition to our next topic, Al, I want to thank you for outlining the mental health struggles and trauma that first responders experience throughout the course of their careers. And then what happens when those same first responders, those same members of law enforcement, are called out to a mental health call.
Mm-hmm.
So you have trauma, mental health, and mental health coming into contact with one another. And one of the parties is licensed to carry a gun and use it. So I want to share something from the Treatment Advocacy Center. The risk of being killed while being approached or stopped by law enforcement in the community is 16 times higher for individuals with untreated serious mental illness than for other civilians. By the most conservative estimates, at least 1 in 4 fatal law enforcement encounters involves an individual with serious mental illness. When data have been rigorously collected and analyzed, findings indicate as many as half of all law enforcement homicides ends in the life of an individual with severe psychiatric disease. Again, this is coming from the Treatment Advocacy Center. Last data point. The arrest-related death program operated by the Bureau of Justice Statistics within the U.S. DOJ is the only federal database that attempts to systematically collect and publish mental health information about law enforcement homicides. The program was suspended in 2015 because the data available to the agency was not credible enough to report. I'm going to guess that the data not being credible enough to report is that there's a lot of underreporting. You and I both know, Al, that law enforcement agencies do not like to give out their homicide statistics. They don't like to do it. So if you're not getting consistent data across the board, I can understand why they would discontinue this program, but it's disappointing to hear because we want to be a data-driven society, and yet when it comes to government and law enforcement in particular, there's data there, and they want to shy away from it. So, Al, talk to me about mental health calls as a member of law enforcement. I don't know, you and I have never really talked about any calls that you've had to go on, but talk to our viewers about what the tendencies are, what the trauma is as it relates to law enforcement going out on calls where you know you're going to be encountering someone who is having a mental health crisis, and how well are you all trained to deal with those calls?
Sure. I believe that the training has increased because of the necessity for it. I mean, it's always been there. It's just with the growth in medical technology and our ability to identify mental health challenges, the training has increased, as well as the public, the communities asking for training of officers, as well as actual professionals, mental health, getting out there. But I could tell you, I could probably count on one hand the amount of times that we took advantage of those mental health professionals. One is that they were limited, and we also didn't want them to get in the way of our scene, of our enforcement activity. So we didn't utilize them to the best practice. There's many times where I just reflected on, as we were doing the planning, I thought it'd probably be a good time to bring out one of these mental health professionals to join us. I looked at it more from the liability side. I said, in the time being, I wasn't trained in mental health, so I didn't know how to really deal with that, other than my training in how to detain somebody. So if we encounter somebody who's acting awkward or not in what we consider normal in our society. Uh, the natural reaction by law enforcement is then to take it as somebody who is non-compliant and possibly trying to do something suspicious. And I mean, there's been many situations where I could recall where there was suspects or people that we encountered that had mental health disorders, but that was not our top priority. Our priority was to do what we were trained and really what our job entailed, and that was really to investigate, detain, arrest. And the mental health stuff, we said, well, once we detained them, then we'll go ahead and find somebody that could work with them, or they'll do that in the jail. But it was never really a top priority. I'm hoping that it's changed a little bit and that it's starting to increase. But I can't say to the point to where I feel comfortable yet. Now, because I do work in the mental health field, I see that it's a significant factor to keeping our community safe. So there were agencies that did have crisis teams that they would allow us to use. We didn't have anybody in mental health assigned to our department, so we would have to go to our local counterparts. We were a federal agency, so our local counterparts would frequently assist us with anything that we were doing. But to go and to have to ask for a mental health professional to come out with us on our enforcement activities was just not something that was not commonly done. So even though we expected that we may encounter that, because the generally federal enforcement will know pretty much everything about who you're going to encounter. They've already done a full investigation on everybody that is involved with whoever your target party is. And at times we identified that there was somebody there that had mental health challenges. And so at that time, now thinking about it, it'd probably be a good thing to bring somebody in the case that person is not understanding the commands that we're giving or not understanding what's happening, just reacts out of their own fight or flight. Yeah. If you're dealing with mental health challenges already, and possibly if you think about schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder, which is like a combination of bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, loud commands or weapons and people in military gear, our current day police gear looks just like military gear, that could really scare somebody into a really bad place. And so then can we then blame somebody for running or for trying to defend themselves out of this fight or flight mode? We just never know. Even we ourselves don't even know how we're going to react when we encounter a traumatic situation. I can't tell you that if somebody comes to me now and puts me in a state of fear, how I'm going to react. I would like to think I'm going to go with a fight or flight, but I might just freeze and do nothing, or I might fight and then try to fight whoever it is that's scaring me. And that then opens the door to major risk for the community or anybody that is facing mental health challenges, as well as the enforcers, the first responders, if they're currently dealing with some unprocessed trauma. There's no guarantee of how that person is going to respond. They may respond with a greater force than what is necessary, and somebody who is not carrying those type of challenges mentally could only look and say, you were excessive in that scenario. And the person who committed it might say, no, I completely was not excessive. I know what I saw. Well, you know what you saw based on the mental the distorted thinking in which they're coming from at that moment.
Well, there's something to what you're saying, Al, because as the data points out, the risk of being killed while being approached or stopped by law enforcement in the community is 16 times higher for individuals with untreated serious mental illness than for other citizens. So there's something to what you're saying. And I appreciate you sharing in great detail what it's like for first responders, members of law enforcement, to go out on mental health calls, and how there are so many elements in place before the two individuals or multiple individuals come into contact with one another that could lend itself to things going wrong. So with that, I want to shift gears to a tragic event that happened on September 16th in Fairfax, Virginia. And I'm representing my university. I'm representing Georgetown because it has affected the Georgetown Hoya family. And I want to give my deepest condolences to Sydney Wilson's family, friends, co-workers, and everyone else that love her. And I also want to offer prayers to Officer Liu and his family with what he's going to have to deal with for the rest of his life. So for our viewers, Sydney Wilson, 33 years old, Georgetown graduate, class of 2013. I graduated from Georgetown in 1990. She played basketball at Georgetown. And according to reports, the Fairfax County Police Department said an officer had responded to a call to the 11800 block of Sunrise Valley Drive in Reston, Virginia at around 10:20 a.m. after a mental health counselor asked police to conduct a welfare check on Wilson, who was reported to be in an agitated state. So the officer involved was Fairfax County Police Officer Peter Liu. And he responded to this welfare check, and he's described as a 14-year veteran trained in crisis intervention. So that's the setup, and I'm going to share with our viewers parts of this video.
Oh, Jesus Christ. Back up! No! Oh, yeah! Back up! Oh, yeah! Oh, yeah! Hey, man. I got nothing to do. Please back up. Oh, yeah! Back up! Oh, yeah. Back up! Back up!
So I didn't show the whole video out of respect for the family and everyone involved. But just to let you know, when the officer got to the residence, knocked on the door, Sydney opened it, said hello twice, and then closed the door. 3 minutes later, after Officer Liu continued to try and get her to open the door, that's when she came out wielding a knife. And she actually cut him. And as you indicated when you were explaining how these situations happen, he's giving her commands. She's not listening to them. She's not following her commands, his commands. And it was reported that there was no escape route for Officer Liu. I wasn't there. I'm just telling you what was said. And tragically, her life ended as this officer felt threatened enough and had been assaulted with the knife to fire, I want to say 5 times, and ended her life at that moment. So as a member of law enforcement, putting yourself in that position, Al, I know you can never know what you would have done. What's your interpretation of the setup, the call from a mental health professional to law enforcement, and then what we saw unfold?
Sure. Yeah. So I did review that incident, and such a tragedy for both parties, and the deceased. My heart goes out to her and her family. Of course, going back and Monday morning quarterbacking, it's just not the same than when you're there. But we could use this as a training opportunity, or to build upon situations like this, because welfare checks in policing is very common, and the fact that a mental health agency contacted police should have given a pretty strong indication that it was going to be a challenging uh, welfare check. So for possible future events, for training in the future, for anybody that's going to do a welfare check, when they know beforehand that it's going to persist of somebody with mental health challenges, and we also don't know what was told to them, as if, was there any harm being done? Was the person committing harm to herself or possibly a threat to others? Then I could see the immediate need to go and then possibly persist to knock on the door. The other side to that can be, as soon as that phone call came in to the police department to do the welfare check from a mental health agency, that's where possibly new procedures could be built upon this as a learning experience, to then go, if the officer knows he's going to encounter somebody with mental health challenges that he may not fully be trained for, then that's when they could reach out and get mental health professionals to go alongside. And we don't know the details of how imminent there may have been a threat, or if it was more just a concern because possibly she had contacted the mental health agency and they knew that she was in some form of psychosis. And so they just said, please go and do a welfare check. So if we want to go back and say what could have been done better, the officer could have taken somebody with him, to make that first approach. And this is being very critical. Of course, we don't know unless we're in that officer's shoes, but looking at it just from the information that we have, the officer knocked on the door. She came to the door and didn't truly respond, but just let him know by her actions, by slamming the door, that she was not interested in talking to police. So at that point, since there was no warrant involved that we're aware of, and I'm assuming that the officer would have handled things a little different had there been an imminent threat, as in if the neighbors would have called and said, this person is, threatening us or something like that, then I'm sure he probably would have had backup, or the situation would have been a little different. It seems like just a basic welfare check. So at that point, once the door was slammed in his face, he could have taken that to, well, she doesn't want to talk to me and doesn't have to talk to me. A welfare check doesn't mean that the police have the right to go into the home, to barge, their way through, or to even talk to the person. The welfare check could have been satisfied with seeing that the person was okay in appearance. I mean, didn't look to be bleeding, or not a lot of harm from first appearance. So they could have stepped back, made some calls, and got the help from mental health professionals. He continued to knock, and if you've ever been on the other side of the door of somebody knocking that way, I mean, it could be it could be frightening, and especially if you're dealing with mental health challenges, of which are unknown at this time. The music came on that kind of gave another indicator that she was not interested in talking to the police at that time. In my experience, as a practitioner in mental health, I've worked with many different people with some of the most severe mental health disorders. I worked where I was working with people that were detained based on their inability to function in the community appropriately. So they were in a detention of some type. And so I would go out and provide resources and therapy and that to those that were already incarcerated, not having broke the law or committed any crime. Their crime was that they were not acting appropriately in the community. So now they're in detention. So I would go there, and I would go inside of the detention, sit right by them, and begin to talk to them. And the overwhelming number one statement that I would hear from the different individuals that I would visit inside of those detention facilities was that they feared police, that just the sight of police scared them to death. And that's what caused them to go even further into these, their mental health panic type of situations, or would not want to leave the home. Often I would try to work with them on, as far as daily life functions, as in what do you have planned for today? There's a library down the street. Would you consider going down to the library and maybe just finding some wellness, finding a book, something that would distract them from just being at home involved in their own distorted thinking? And they would often say, "I'm scared to death to leave my home." And I would say, "Well, what is it that you're such in fear of? Why do you not want to leave the house?" And they would say, "Because the police." And I said, "Well, you don't have any warrants, or you have no reason for the police to stop you, do you?" And they would say, "Just because I'm me, I'm going to get pulled over. I'm going to get stopped. And you don't know what it's like." These are words that I would hear from those facing mental health challenges on a consistent basis. And so I could only imagine for her behind the door, hearing the pounding, and just this just repeated, let me come inside. He handled it well, as in trying to be relational, and I'm only here to check on you, that type of thing. But we don't know what she's going through in her thoughts, and that's why I thought it would be more appropriate for, once he knocked one time and saw that she did not want any interaction with him, at that point he can't force himself in. Protected by Fourth Amendment rights, we're protected from government intrusion into the home. So really, he had no authority to go any further. Once she closed the door, and slamming it in his face is a pretty strong indicator that she's not interested. Then putting music on loud to where she doesn't have to hear him continue to knock on the door. So those kind of things could have been somewhat triggering to her. We don't know, but I'm just giving examples. This could have been a trigger that could have been handled, or something in a different way, or something that we could learn from for the future.
So Al, it's safe to say you're curious to know why Officer Liu knocked the second time after receiving some pretty strong evidence that she didn't want to talk to him.
Yes, I'm wondering why he was persistent, knowing that there's something going on mentally, because the initial call came from the mental health agency that she's already working with. And by her slamming the door, that's giving you, a pretty loud statement, or a pretty visual statement, that says, "I don't want anything to do with you. Please just leave me alone." And so somebody who's suffering with distorted thinking may find themselves in danger. They're here for me. They want to attack me. We have no idea what she's going through, but we do know that she didn't want any interaction with police. So at that point, he could have pulled back, maybe just went to the end of the hallway to still be involved in the welfare check, as in her overall well-being. But she's already expressed she wants no interaction with him, so he could have taken a step back. And if he felt that it was severe enough, felt that there was a reason enough, then he could have called some mental health professional to come and join him in that.
So let's talk about more. You had mentioned previously that when you were in a similar situation, you didn't choose to call a mental health clinician because you thought they might get in the way, cumbersome, whatever. And I can appreciate that. I found out a couple of years ago that in San Diego, they have a PERT team. And PERT is an acronym for Psychiatric Emergency Response Team. And they didn't have very many clinicians, but those clinicians' jobs were to accompany members of law enforcement for calls similar to what could have been made for Miss Wilson.
Yes.
Well, I did some research and I discovered that Fairfax County has their own version of a PERT team.
Mm-hmm.
And it's called the Mobile Crisis Unit. So according to the Fairfax County website, the Mobile Crisis Unit is available 24/7. The MCU responds to calls from police. I'm going to say that again. They respond to calls from police and fire and rescue for critical incidents, barricades, hostage situations, and mass casualties. The MCU's goal is to develop the least restrictive treatment options for individuals who may be a danger to themselves or others. So I want to share this. I want to share this on the screen because if our viewers can see, MCU works with, if you look down to where I've highlighted in blue, again, 24 hours, and they work with individuals who are experiencing a mental health emergency and who need but are unwilling or unable to seek mental health treatment, and who are, as a result of psychiatric condition, may be a danger to themselves or others. Examples of services including, you can see down low, psychiatric crisis. So I wanted to share that because according to the video that we've seen, there didn't appear to be an MCU clinician with Officer Liu. And if there wasn't, based on what the mobile crisis unit describes itself to be, they don't respond unless they are called by police, fire, and rescue. So based on what you were saying, Al, maybe Officer Liu figured I can handle this myself. I don't need an MCU clinician. It also described Officer Liu as being trained in crisis intervention. I'd like to know how much training he had, because across the board, when I talk to members of law enforcement, they will tell me 99.9% of the time, we don't have very much training.
Right.
We have some training, but we don't have very much training in dealing with mental health calls. So the question for me is, if an MCU clinician wasn't there, why didn't the officer call for an MCU clinician to be there? And it's just a question that I have. And unfortunately, Al, when you say, well, this could be a teaching experience, far too often the teaching experience comes after a loss of life.
Right.
There's not enough proactive work and preventative work and preventative training being done, in my opinion. So I just wanted to put that out there and get your final thoughts on not just this particular situation that happened in Fairfax County, Virginia, but when it comes to law enforcement dealing with their own trauma, dealing with their own mental health and well-being challenges as a result of the profession, enough where suicide is the number one cause of death amongst law enforcement. And mental health calls that they respond to. In your opinion, what do you think is the best way to avoid another Sidney Wilson situation anywhere in the country?
Sure. Well, that could be rectified by enacting policy within individual departments, or even through legislation. But when police are aware that there is something related to mental health, in which they don't have the expertise, because sometimes the limited training that is given by police departments to its officers may be more along the lines of checking a box.
Yeah.
There is a lot of training that goes on, and really the thoughts of an officer are just to get back out there on the streets, as in, I don't really have a lot of time for this training. Let me just check the box, as in, let me just be present in the room where training is happening, but I'm not really too engaged in this thing. I mean, and that may just be more opinion based, but the training is not extensive. So there may need to be some policy changes, that if there is an awareness beforehand, as in a call comes in, a 5150, somebody acting inappropriately in the community, unable to act appropriately out in the community, so then police must respond, then that should immediately trigger that psychiatric emergency response team to also come out. If there was a fire in the same location as a call to, an aggravated assault, police would not be expected to put out the fire. They're not trained in that. They would immediately call the fire department, and they would wait as long as it took for them to get there, because that's not their area of expertise. Why would we handle mental health any differently? On the thoughts of law enforcement is to do exactly that, enforce the law, not deal with mental health situations. And so that's often looked at as secondary or just something not at the top priority. So this is just my speculation, but the call came in for a welfare check. Welfare checks are normally mentally taken as, that's not a high priority. Let me just go get this done and over with really quick. And I'm thinking that the officer may have felt that bringing somebody out from mental health services may have prolonged the reason or the time for that specific call. One thing that police across the nation are dealing with is the lack of police, is just not hiring enough people. And so that means that police will have a lot more calls that they need to respond to within a certain amount of time. And so when there's a welfare check somewhere in there, you're thinking, let me get this done with in 5 minutes. I just got to get it done. And so when I heard the knocking, I kind of, when you've been there, you could kind of read between the lines of what you're watching. And so I'm thinking he's being very persistent because he needs to get this done, because he can't leave until he could write something in his report. Because if a call came in, it's documented in the 911 call. And so he has to be able to document that he made an attempt to look into the scene. So it also becomes possible liability, as in, did you appropriately look into the welfare check? And so he wants to get it done. I just need to get in this door so that you could give me the right answer. You're okay? Okay, great. Let me go now do what I need to do, what my priority is, and that's to enforce the law. Now, I can't say that that's what the officer was thinking. Obviously, I can't read his mind. But that is something that I could easily consider to be one of the factors in there. He has 10 calls ahead of him, and he's just wanting to get this one out of the way really quick. So I don't have time really to call somebody for mental health support. Even though I know it's a mental health call, I don't necessarily have the time for that. So let me just get this done really quick. And he paid dearly, and even more the victim.
So Al, you brought up there's a shortage of cops. We know that. There's also a shortage of these type of clinicians, because I know at one point in time, San Diego County had 12 PERT clinicians. 12 for the whole county. So that's not going to work. It's not going to work effectively. And to your point, we don't know the policies and procedures of the Fairfax County Police Department when it comes to responding to these calls. So I'd be curious to know what those are. And then when you talk about there not being enough clinicians, well, that's a budgetary decision,
right?
Los Angeles has their own version of MCU, their own version of PERT. Mm-hmm. And I took the liberty of looking at the county budgets. Well, for public health, they have over $4 million. I'm sorry, $4 billion. My bad. Mm-hmm. And out of that $4 billion, mental health has, I think 7%. I have the numbers right here in front of me. Mm-hmm. Point being is, if you show me your budget, you're also showing me what's important to you. Mm-hmm. If I look at your household budget of your family, I'll know exactly what's important to your family. Mm-hmm. So if there's not enough money being devoted to PERT clinicians and other types of clinicians that go out on these mental health calls, it lets me know that it's not a high priority for the county. Mm-hmm. So lastly, I want to end with this. There are too many things that law enforcement is responsible to responding to. right? Cat in the tree, you know, the stories you used to do. My cat's in the tree, call the fire department. My friend's choking on the chicken bone. We call the police department for way too many things. And we, the people, have to interact with our elected officials on a regular basis. If we're not satisfied with the customer service that we're receiving from government, and the first line of customer service when it comes to government is law enforcement. You don't see state senators every day. You don't see members of the House of Representatives every day. I see a cop every day. Mm-hmm. So we have to determine as American citizens, locally and then nationally, what do we want law enforcement responding to? Because we'll never know what Miss Wilson's response would have been to a clinician showing up as opposed to a member of law enforcement on a welfare check. Why does a member of law enforcement have to show up to someone's residence for a welfare check? I'm just asking the question. That's all I'm asking. And this isn't anything against Fairfax, Officer Lou, or anything. It's about the system. Who made the decision across the board that members of law enforcement respond to welfare checks at someone's home? If someone's out in the street, law enforcement has two main responsibilities: to enforce the law and to maintain public safety. And if there's a person out in the street wielding a knife, well, that's a threat to public safety. Correct, Al?
That's right.
That's an appropriate response based on what law enforcement's responsibilities are when it comes to maintaining public safety and enforcing the law. Someone's home, welfare check? I don't know. That doesn't make sense to me. So I just wanted to end on that note. I want to thank you once again, Al, for bringing your expertise to the Cops and Convicts podcast. I can't thank you enough for continuing to make time for this type of discussion. I love it, man. I love you. I love the relationship that we have. And I want to have you come back, and I want to make you a regular, because we don't have to just discuss law enforcement. You have such a diverse experience when it comes to, you served in the military. You were a DEA agent and you were a deputy at the infamous Maricopa County Sheriff Department. Maybe that's the next time we talk, Al. I want to get deep into Sheriff Joe Arpaio and the Maricopa County Sheriff's Department, and Joe Arpaio getting a pardon from former President Trump because he was tried and convicted for criminal activity. That's gonna be our next time we get together, Al. Because I'm fascinated by it, bro. Anything else you want to add? You want to plug anything before we get out of here?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, count me in. I'm willing to talk about it. I mean, I'm all about just exposing truth, because that's what really will make us better. I talked a lot about my time in isolation, as in not being able to deal with my own emotions, and I thank God that I've been given freedom in my relationship with God and my Lord and Savior Jesus, that I'm able to be free now, and it's taken work, but it could be done, and that's for anybody that's dealing with any type of mental health challenges or just distorted thinking, these thoughts that are just out of control, and it's causing change in behavior. That there is a solution, and so I found my solution by praying and processing. And if there's not somebody particular that you could trust, I found that I could trust God and I could share all things with him. And that's how I began to process a lot of the traumas that I carried. And I'd like to believe that I'm absolutely free of all of that. And so that's why I like to talk and share about it, to help expose anything that's hidden and isolated within anybody else's thoughts, because there is freedom.
I appreciate that, Al. I'm right there with you. And for those that are watching, stay tuned. We are getting our authorization from TikTok to go live on TikTok. Next Tuesday, we'll be back. 5 p.m. Pacific time, I will be interviewing Mrs. CC Strong. She is a current member of the LA County Sheriff's Department. She's suing the Sheriff's Department. She has a book that she's written about her experience inside the Sheriff's Department, so I can't wait to have her on. CC, if you're watching, looking forward to it. Hey, man, another episode of Cops and Convicts podcast in the books. Al, thanks again. Until we meet again, y'all be good out there. Be safe.
Be safe. Thanks.